What is art?
Art is
history.
What is art? That's a good question.
This is Art Uncovered.
Art is our collective cultural history.
A weekly podcast that brings you interviews with an eclectic mix of artists and creators.
Art is
disappointing your parents.
I'm your host, Kimberly.
I've acquired this code of whiteness through this academic field that was not made for me. And so I have been able to speak in a way that validates myself and the work that I do. Whereas like if I came in with an El Paso accent and didn't have like this vocabulary, then I wouldn't be taken as serious. And so this is how I see this work, this almost like a visual representation of code switching, of going back and forth.
Thanks for tuning in, everyone. That was the voice of this week's guest, Juan Carlos Escobedo, a San Antonio-based artist whose work explores his identity as a queer, brown Mexican-American raised in a low socioeconomic community along the U.S.-Mexico border. In this episode, we talk about the culture shock Juan experienced moving from the South to the Northeast, his experience with residual class and race shame, and his quote-unquote high-end fashion label of garments made largely out of cardboard. Stay with us. Welcome back, listeners. Thanks again for tuning in to this week's episode of Art Uncovered. This week, I am so honored to be here with Juan Carlos Escobedo. Juan, thank you for joining us. And thanks so much for doing this via the time difference. You're currently in residency in Berlin, I learned.
Yes, it's well, right now it's like afternoon, it's morning in where you're at. But yeah, thank you for inviting me. This is really fun and exciting, and I mean like my favorite thing is talking about myself, so this is perfect.
Excellent. My favorite thing is asking people about themselves, so we're starting off with a good relationship. So Juan, I'd like to start the conversation because your work largely explores your own identity, so I'm wondering if we could maybe begin by having you tell us a bit about yourself and maybe your upbringing.
Sure. So I'm originally from El Paso, Texas. So that's like on the border of the United States and the Mexican border. And that space specifically is a little special because it's like one of the very few spaces in like along the border where like these cities interact with each other. Usually in other spaces, it takes a while. Like you cross the border and then maybe like the next city in Mexico is, I don't know, like an hour or 2 hours away, but Ciudad Juarez and El Paso are right next to each other. And they're called like the twin cities or sister cities. So that's like a really major part of my upbringing. My parents are from Mexico. My dad originally was raised in Mexico City and my mom in the middle of Chihuahua, and then I think in the 70s she came up to work in Ciudad Juarez, like a lot of other families. So yeah, that was my main like upbringing. The truth is also that I was born in El Paso, but I was raised in a small town in New Mexico, which is like right next to El Paso. It's like literally a 5-minute driving distance. It's called Sunland Park, New Mexico, but I just say El Paso because if I say Sunland Park, people are like, "What the hell are you talking about?" Sunland.
Yeah. Question: what do your parents do, or what did they do when you were growing up?
Yeah, so my mom, she had like various jobs, but like when she would cross over, she would take care of children and she was like nanny and a cook and stuff like that. Later, she had like various jobs. She basically ended up working in some factories in Santa Teresa, which is they made these giant circuit boards for like the internet. So she would like put these things together. And my dad was a body shop mechanic, so yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm curious because I read that you went to graduate school in mass art. Was that a big cultural difference for you moving to the
Yeah,
Northeast,
I mean,
especially
major.
Boston.
Yeah, totally. No, it was like a major culture shock. I think because El Paso, Sunland Park, Ciudad Juarez, it's very brown, right? And it's like a Spanish speaking community. Like everybody speaks Spanish, even like people that move there eventually start learning Spanish. And there is a military base in the northeast of El Paso, but still like it's so predominantly Hispanic. So I sort of grew up in this weird bubble where, I mean, like my mom always, because she would cross over illegally into the United States when she was young. Eventually, she acquired residence, but she was like, I'm a wetback, but you guys are American citizens. You can do whatever you want. You can be whatever you want. And so going to Boston was a major culture shock, especially because people started to, it was like the first time that I started to feel like a foreigner basically in, I mean, a country that I grew up in. People kept asking me things like where I learned English so well and where was my motherland and what was it? Yeah,
Is that
so
how they
just,
would phrase it?
yeah, somebody asked me, where's your motherland? And I was like, Texas. Yeah, and people just kept assuming that I was an international student.
Ah,
And I guess, sorry, I keep like my throat is all weird, but
no, you're fine.
um, yeah, and they just kept like assuming I was an international student, and in the beginning, I didn't necessarily think much of it, but as it continued happening, and even with like peers and stuff like that, like within the program that I was in, I was like, oh, okay, like I'm not seen as like American. So yeah, major
Mm,
culture shock, and just like the landscape itself too. Not only like those things, but everything weather-wise in Boston, aside from the blizzards or the snow, is very soft, right?
mm,
And in like the Southwest, the weather's just so, I don't know how to explain it, but it just like beats on you, like the sun, the rain, whenever it happens, like so
mm,
yeah, like landscape-wise, people-wise, it was major culture shock, which
mhm.
eventually led to some of the work that I started doing, which revolved around like just basically me being homesick and recreating these little tiny maquettes of these homes that I used to live in when
Uh,
I was.
yeah, I would like to maybe stay on this topic for a bit. So, can you give us a little bit, because obviously you were making art prior to going to graduate school. So I'm curious what kind of work you were making before you moved, and then maybe we could focus on the work that you began in graduate school.
Totally. In undergrad, I went to New Mexico State University, and it was a pretty like traditional, I guess, learning experience. So I was doing a lot of figurative work. I'm trained as a painter,
Mm.
like oils and stuff like that. And so at the time, I was really invested in dreams and surrealism and like fantasy stuff. So I created this series around this character called Buffalo Man.
Is this
And
on your website by any chance?
it should be
Okay, I'm gonna try a
the
screen share here.
sure.
Yeah, so listeners, if you're not watching this on YouTube, you can watch it on YouTube, and you could see some visuals for Juan's work. Uh, so I'm gonna search here. So I assume it would be
You
under
go to
portfolio.
it would go under painting, so all the way down.
Okay, gotcha.
Painting. And so here you see some,
Oh,
but yeah. So it's like this weird Minotaur man that I at in the beginning I was dreaming about him a lot in different situations, and then it sort of evolved into me creating these scenarios where it's things that I was going through, right? Like, I mean, I don't want to get too personal or stuff, but like partying too much and meeting like really shitty friends. And so I sort of made it into like this weird fantasy about like this character trying to find like his place or something.
is this the character you're referring to?
Yeah, yeah.
I actually see some resemblance to your current work with like the headdress and the costuming and the performance.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, it's like those silhouettes, I keep recreating them.
Hmm.
And unfortunately, I don't have any images of this, but when I graduated and I did my BFA show, I had these four paintings, like these ones that we're seeing right now, on a wall. And then I created these collages out of tissue paper. And I embedded like different objects like glass and seeds and flowers and stuff like that. And I put them in front of those paintings because I was trying to recreate like the feeling of a dream. So like have people like walk through them. And people, I mean, I think they just saw them as objects rather than installations, so they walked around it. So when I graduated in 2010, finally applied to grad school in late 2012, and then got into 2013. So my idea was like, I want to move beyond the rectangle or the square and try to see if I can make these more surrealist or make it more like at the time I didn't know what it was, but like a more immersive experience, right? So like where you're actually experiencing these scenes like you would in a dream where it's confusing and you're suddenly in one space and then another, blah, blah, blah.
So would you say when you moved to graduate school that you kind of dropped this idea of the dream and focused more on your experience in the real world?
Well, in the beginning, I was still drawing or painting this houseman character, but what I was doing is I was painting him on tissue paper. But as I was working on it, people kept, or like my professors were encouraging me a lot to abstract him more. And then at the same time, like these whole things were happening where people were like asking questions about where I was, da 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 da. And also, my father died that year. So I think I became, no, it's okay. I became slightly homesick in a way. And it just happened by accident. I had this class with George Kramer, who was a very generous professor, and it was called Painted Objects. And he would just like set like these tasks for us where we're experimenting with material and shape and form. And he said to create houses that we knew. And so I made or recreated a like a small trailer home that I grew up in.
Cool.
And then it sort of like it just it just went through, like it was like a domino effect from there.
Can you talk about your materials? I see a lot of cardboard, wood, looks like kind of material you'd find like for free on the streets.
Yeah, basically. Well, because well, one of the things, like I mentioned before, I came into this program, which maybe I should have applied to the 3D program, but I just didn't know. But it's a 2D program, wanted to move away from the square or the rectangle, was invested in trying to make this stuff like more immersive, but also I had very little money, so I just started to just pick up objects and start fucking with them, right? And messing with them and seeing like what can I make out of them. And so cardboard itself, I was really drawn to initially because, well, it was free. And I'm not a sculptor, right? I mean, people have called these objects, the ones especially that I make, sculpture, but I don't consider myself like somebody. I mean, I wasn't trained in it. But what I liked about cardboard was that it was flat, but then also you can manipulate it in a way so that it could stand on its own. And then it could be, it's lightweight. And so initially it was just for like logistical reasons, but then I just had this sort of, I mean, I don't want to be all poetic and be like, and a connection to cardboard, but but it was just something like, oh, this made sense. It just felt natural and normal to me for me to use it. And there was also no preciousness to it. Like I found myself in the past with painting and pigments being like, I have to save this fucking cadmium orange because it's so expensive or whatever. And with the cardboard and these like found materials, it was easier to be like, you know what, it didn't work out, let me move on to the next thing. And so I think that helped me like progress a little bit faster.
That's great. Did I read somewhere that you got a little bit of criticism for using cardboard?
Yeah, I got a lot of criticism for it because I think, well, because I was talking about memories and dreams. At the time, I was not really talking about feeling homesick because I felt like I didn't know how to like vocalize it or verbalize it. So
Mhm.
people kept saying that, well, they were confused by it. They were like, why are you using cardboard or these found objects to represent an idea or a concept that is too poetic or too pretty when the material itself is not,
Hmm.
right? And yeah, so there was like a lot of pushback, and there was that was like always the first question, which I guess in a sense that's good, right? Like they were questioning why cardboard, but they never gave me a reason to not use it. You know, like I felt like them saying this material is not good enough. I was like, well, I feel like it is, right? Like
Mm.
there was
And
other artists.
did you continue using it?
Yes, I continued
Okay.
using it just because I don't know, maybe I was being trying to be rebellious or something.
There was another theme that you wrote about on your website. I'm wondering if you could maybe expand on it or kind of clarify it. It was this idea called residual class slash race shame.
Yeah.
Yeah, what do you mean by this?
Well, I think that growing up as a brown kid, especially in like a Hispanic community, there's a lot of colorism that occurs within the community or that is like practice where people with lighter skin or lighter eyes are deemed more valuable than somebody that's like my color. And so, and everybody does it basically. Like you grow up and you're like, oh, and you'll have like families where maybe like you have siblings and one or two of them are a little bit lighter, and then they're always seen as the the better
Hmm.
how do I say this? Like catches or the better, yeah, like the better versions of the family.
Hmm.
And so I think that that's something that you essentially have to like carry, right? And then so that's like one level, and then like you go into like white United States, and then you find another level of like, oh, you're like this brown person that,
Hmm.
yeah, like where are you from? But where are you really from? You know, so there's always like this shame that you have to like mitigate to an extent in different ways, and people do it in different ways. And the work that, and I won't get ahead of myself, but like the work that I'm doing now sort of talks about these two ways of mitigating my presence in these white spaces.
Mhm. Yeah, I actually think it might be a good time to switch. So we spoke about kind of your exploration of spaces or non-spaces such as dreams, then your kind of your physical home. But it seems like what naturally started happening is you started exploring yourself and your identity. Um, is there anything on your website here that we could give visuals for some of that self-portraiture work?
If you want, you could start looking at the Houseman stuff, which is sort
Okay.
of what happened right after grad school. And it's right at the top, yeah.
Yep.
So here, if you go all the way to the bottom, you'll probably see some collages, but also there's like some video work.
Mm-hmm.
But I started off trying to, since I left grad school. I could no longer make these maquettes or these giant installations. So I was thinking of a way to reduce it or reduce these like landscapes. And so this is sort of what manifested. It was creating this mask, which, like you said before, looks a little bit silhouette-wise like the Buffalo Man that I created. I was thinking a lot about how you sort of like carry these environments that you've lived in. And so this is another story where it's like this character that came out of like time or something, and they're trying to get to like their home, which nobody knows where it's at.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so then so within like Houseman, I'm exploring my identity and not really finding like this connection between the cardboard and myself. The way that cardboard is seen or deemed as, well, first of all, like there's parallels between it, like it's brown, I'm brown, but it's also this object that's utilitarian. It's used to put stuff away. Um, it's something that's disposable, right? Like you can just get rid of it. And it just feels like always tentative. And in that sense, like that's how I felt. Like I'm brown. I shouldn't have gone into an art program. I should have probably tried to be a doctor or a lawyer so that I could bring like some kind of like money to the family. And also just like even though I am a citizen, like my citizenship has always felt like tentative because of my parents' status, right? Whether they were illegal or they were just like residents. And even like just a few years ago when Donald Trump was like, all anchor babies, regardless of their age, are going back. And so I was like, is that going to be something that is going to happen to me and reflect on me? Am I going to be pushed out? So in that sense, that's how I saw Houseman and trying to um, embody those things, but through this weird lens.
Yeah, there was another term that you mentioned. I loved your statement on your website here. There was another term that you mentioned in that called psychological homelessness. Is this how do you think this relates to this idea of residual class / race shame?
Sure. So with psychological homelessness, from my understanding of it, and this usually happens with like first generation immigrants. So when like somebody like let's say moves to one country to do whatever they need to do, right? Like work or blah 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 blah. In that community, they're not accepted because they're foreigners. But then they go back to the their original community for whatever reason, maybe it's just to visit or maybe just to live again, then they're also sort of rejected within that community as well because now they have either somehow evolved or acquired some kind of I don't know, mannerisms, right, that they needed to do or they needed to use in order to assimilate. And so they're like sort of in this in-between space where they don't belong in one space or they don't belong in the other. And there's even a term in Spanish for like Chicano people or like immigrant workers that's like it says ni de aquí ni de allá, so not from here, not from there. And so I think that that's what psychological homelessness is. In terms of, I don't know what the connection is, honestly, between like the class and race shame. But that's a really good question, and I need to
Yeah,
think.
yeah. And maybe I misspoke there. Maybe they are two separate, but yeah, both of them existed in your kind of exploration of your work. I'm curious if, you mentioned briefly the work that you're currently working on. Do you think this body of work explores either one or both of those ideas?
I think it might be exploring both because initially when I started doing it, so
Yeah, let's explain what
uh,
it is first.
yeah,
Yeah.
so the work that I'm creating now is this like pseudo fashion line called By J-esque, and that title J-esque is like a play on J. Crew. And this came after the Houseman series. So I love the Houseman work and I'm still making it and like the videos, and it's opened up a lot of like venues to collaboration with young students and blah 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 blah. But for some reason, and I think I always do this, which is fine, but it went too like science fiction-y. And I wanted to root it in something that we understand or reality. And I remember Jill Salzberger, Zuckerman, I think. I probably butchered her name, but she was a really great mentor at Mass Art. And she's like, you create these fantasies, which are great, but you need to try to help the audience enter into the fantasies by grounding them in an object that we understand, right? Like from our reality. And
What
so
great advice. Wow.
I know. So I was like, that was something that I thought about always, but I didn't know how to do it. At the same time, while I was doing the houseman, I was thinking a lot about this installation that I wanted to create, which that is not on here, but
Mhm.
it was this larger installation that obviously I didn't have money for, or I didn't know how to um, like where to install it, and I still haven't created it. But part of it was to create these little cardboard shelves, and actually you can see those online. If you go to portfolio and you go to repisitas
Mhm.
there, I started creating these little shelves and I didn't know what to do with them. I was just making them because they were going to go inside a trailer home that I created out of cardboard. But I was making them and just stuffing them in a closet, and the closet shelves were becoming full. And then I started clipping them to hangers just to make space for them.
Oh.
And from there, one day I opened this closet and I'm like, oh, these can be a thing. These can be closed, right? They
Ah,
can,
brilliant.
yeah. And so from there, I was like, that's the ground. Like that's where the objects that we recognize, because clothes are, whether you are into fashion or not, like clothes are such a part of our life, right? Like we use it to cover ourselves, to protect ourselves from the elements, blah, 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 to make us feel comfortable or uncomfortable, whatever. And so I started seeing these clothes, especially in the beginning, because it was just cardboard, as rather than trying to project like an ideal of me, it was a way to like show people like my original background, right? And so if you
Mm.
scroll all the way down, um, you'll see like some of the more. I started with like this brown trench coat, and then it went from there.
Oh, these are so great, Juan.
Thank you. Yeah, and so I attached like these catalog descriptions. So that's the first ever cardboard piece that I made. Um, and then added these descriptions that were really stupid, like me making fun of it somehow. And then
Need
just
something
kept
to keep
making,
you warm this winter.
yeah, exactly. And and they were for me really successful, and I tried to show them to people and they still didn't make sense to them, which was fine. I mean, they understood that they were pants or whatever, trenches or shirts, but they were like, what is this? And so I continued making them 2017 out of cardboard. And then around 2020 or 2021, I started incorporating these white homes or these white spaces. And initially, it was me thinking about something happened in San Antonio where there was a major snow blizzard that wiped out the electrical grid. And so people were out of water and electricity for a few weeks. But I heard some reports that some of the more nicer affluent areas didn't experience any of this hardship. And so it sort of made me upset. And I mean, I've never been like somebody that's like a protester or that goes out and does anything about anything. So I was like, well, how do I harness this into the work? And I started to think about a material that was like cardboard, but that didn't need any explanation or that was seen as neutral. And so it was actually a really simple answer, and it was the white paper. And so I made these white homes, which initially, and I still sort of do, replicate like these TV homes and movie homes that as a kid, I used to like really yearn to live in.
Hmm.
And so I started juxtaposing them with these brown landscapes. And what I found was that these white spaces started to validate the brown spaces. Yeah, and so like people just stopped questioning them and just being like, oh, okay, right?
Hmm.
And for a while, and I'm sorry if I'm ranting, so just
No, no,
stop.
please, please continue.
For a while, I was confused because, well, the paper was physically, the brown paper, I mean, the cardboard, I found a lot of similarities with it, right? Like identity-wise. But then I was like, one of the reasons why I no longer do figures, at least, is because I just am afraid, right, of like body politics and having to talk about it or think about it and whatever. And so that's why for a while, like the rule was just use brown cardboard because it was so attached to me, but also far away from like the body that I didn't have to explain it, I guess, if that makes any sense. So the issue when I started incorporating these white homes and these white spaces was, am I allowed to talk about whiteness, right? Like, and I was confused and I was like, fuck, like, what is this gonna do? But then also, like, nobody was fucking paying attention to me. And even now, I mean, like, who's paying attention? I mean, people are, but it's not like, you know? But eventually I started thinking about like whiteness and how I sort of perform it to an extent. So when I think about having to mitigate my brownness, I've done it in two ways, right? So the first way is by presenting myself like in a very clean and sort of like manicured manner and like my clothes. And I mean, I don't wear expensive clothes, but ever since I was a kid, like my mom would always emphasize like, we can't be Mexican and poor and dirty. We have to make sure that we present ourselves in a way that like those things aren't held up against us, right? And so that was really important to me. But then another way that I mitigate my brownness now is the way that basically my education and the way that I speak, right? So I've acquired this code of whiteness through this academic field that was not made for me, right? It was made for white people with a middle class or above background. And so I guess I don't know successfully, but have been able to speak in a way that people now or validates myself and the work that I do, right? Whereas like if I came in with an El Paso accent and didn't have like this vocabulary, then I wouldn't be taken as serious. And so this is how I see this work, this almost like a visual representation of code switching, of going back and forth. But then at the same time, within white spaces, I'm seen as like this brown foreigner. And then within the brown spaces, I'm seen as like this uppity brown person that speaks like a white, like a white person. It's like the weirdest thing.
One thing that I really appreciate when looking at your work there is, and I think I even mentioned this at the beginning of the conversation, that when I mentioned the brown cardboard, I said, oh, it looks like stuff that you would pick up for free on the street. And then your characterization of the white homes looks like they could be presidential homes.
Right. And I feel like, and I guess that's good. A lot of people have
I think it's
mentioned
really
that.
good. Yeah.
Yeah, like there's like this weird tension, right? Because honestly, I mean, like I'm seeing it in terms of like my own identity and code switching, but it also looks a little bit like gentrification. Like somebody mentioned, like these pieces are sometimes like the gentrification of like a brown body, and I've worn these pieces, and I've done this collaboration with this modeling agency in Austin called Ivy League, which were really awesome, and a photographer named Shannon Bright. And the models were beautiful and gorgeous, and they wore the clothes. But I feel like the clothes are a little bit more successful off of a body, just because then people can project their own body on them. So I try to set them up like a boutique or like a commercial space or like a window display. So like if you go, for example, into an H&M, the way you would look at a shirt or a pair of pants and be like, would this work good on me, or will this be flattering? This would sort of do the opposite. You would be taking on either these brown or those white characteristics, and then you'd have to sort of deal with the ramifications.
So I'm curious, is this the body of work that you're working on in residency in Berlin right now?
Yes. So I'm right now not so much like jackets. I've been like focusing on these accessories. So because it's like, I don't know why my brain works like this, but I go into like this fantasy where it's like, this is a fashion line, right? And so I was thinking like originally like how a couture house or like a fashion house usually does like these couture pieces or like these pieces that are like really big and blah 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 blah. And then what's the next step? Like once they become global or a brand where they become more accessible is that they venture into like handbags or purses or perfumes. And so that's sort of what I've been doing here a little bit. So I created an umbrella. I created some purses, which I had already been doing, but and then I'm working on this headdress right now that's the silhouette looks like a traditional headdress from Bavaria or something, and seeing if I've been incorporating
Oh,
rather than like these TV homes, I've been incorporating institutions here, like Humboldt Forum, which is a museum here, which is like major and big, but like has like some problematic acquisitions of work from like Africa, different areas. So trying to like juxtapose these buildings with like the brown spaces that I grew up in, and seeing how that goes. Yeah.
brilliant. Do you have any upcoming shows for your recent work?
Um, right now there's work at the McNay Art Museum in San Antonio. I'm also working on this show, which is going to deal more with like Chicano futurism in Austin at the Austin Community College. There's also going to be a solo show in the Mesquite Center of Arts. That's in Texas as well. I think that's it, unless I'm missing something.
Yeah, so I'll get those links from you if you don't mind. That way I could share them on our website and social media. Listeners, if any of you are from Texas, El Paso, did you say Austin?
Yeah, this is because I'm based out of San Antonio now, so there's gonna be one in Austin and then Mesquite, Texas, which is like northeast-ish of Dallas, I think. So
Wonderful, wonderful. Yeah, so listeners, I'll share all of that information. Juan, thank you so much for speaking with us today and for sharing your work. It was an absolute honor, and I hope to see your work one day in person.
yeah, absolutely, that would be great. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thanks again for tuning in. My guest this week was Juan Carlos Escobedo, whose work explores his identity as a queer, brown, Mexican-American raised in a low socioeconomic community along the U.S.-Mexico border. Juan has a number of upcoming exhibitions, all of which is detailed on his Instagram account, which is linked to on our website, artuncoveredpodcast.com. Please be sure to tune in next week. I will be speaking with Michael Ambron, a New York-based artist and paint maker. In the episode, we talk about Michael's interest in meditation, his visual exploration of his experience with sleep apnea, and his paint making business. Hope to see y'all then. Have a safe week. Bye-bye.